The morning of December 20th, 1944, a frozen foxhole 3 miles southeast of Bastogne, Belgium. 12 American paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division crouch in positions hastily scraped from earth that fights back like concrete. Their breath hangs in clouds that betray their positions. Through the fog and snow, they can hear it. The deep, guttural rumble of diesel engines, the metallic clink of tank tracks, the rhythmic crunch of hundreds of boots marching through frozen fields. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Staff Sergeant James Martin peers through the morning mist toward the tree line 400 yards distant. What emerges makes his stomach tighten. Grey uniforms, dozens of them, then hundreds. Behind them, the unmistakable silhouette of German armour. He counts 12 men in his position, 12 rifles, 2 bazookas, 1 .30 caliber machine gun with maybe 300 rounds, against what looks like an entire battalion. The radio man whispers urgently into the handset. "Command, this is Outpost 7. We've got heavy enemy movement. Request permission to fall back." Static, then a voice, calm but firm. "Negative. Outpost 7. You hold that position. The entire southern perimeter depends on you. Do you understand? You hold." Martin looks at his men, farm boys from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, a college kid from Boston who still carries his acceptance letter to law school in his jacket pocket. None of them over 23 years old. All of them cold, hungry, and exhausted from 6 days of continuous combat. He knows what's being asked of them. He knows the mathematics are impossible, but he also knows something the Germans don't yet understand. These aren't ordinary soldiers. These are paratroopers, the Screaming Eagles, and they don't know how to retreat. The German column advances with the confidence of overwhelming force. They have numbers. They have tanks. They have victory within reach. What they don't have is an understanding of the American spirit when pushed to its absolute limit. In the next 72 hours, this small band of paratroopers will write a story so improbable that even they won't fully believe it when it's over. They will hold a position that military doctrine says requires a company. They will face attacks that should overwhelm them 10 times over. They will transform a frozen foxhole into a fortress of pure determination. This is not the story of the entire siege of Bastogne. That epic has been told. This is the story of the forgotten positions, the unnamed outposts, the small groups of men scattered around the perimeter who held fragments of the line that, if broken, would have collapsed the entire defense. This is the story of how 12 American paratroopers stopped what they believed was impossible, and how their stand became a microcosm of everything Bastogne represented. To understand how these 12 men ended up in this frozen hell, we must rewind 6 days, to December 16th, 1944, when Adolf Hitler launched his most desperate gamble. The Allies had liberated France. They stood on Germany's doorstep. Victory seemed inevitable, which was precisely why Hitler chose this moment to strike. In absolute secrecy, the Wehrmacht assembled a massive force in the dense Eifel forests of Germany. 410,000 troops, 1,400 tanks and assault guns, 2,600 artillery pieces. They moved at night, maintained radio silence, used horses to transport supplies to avoid engine noise. American intelligence saw nothing. The thinly held Ardennes sector of Belgium seemed the quietest part of the entire front. At 5:30 on the morning of December 16th, the forest erupted. 1,600 German artillery pieces opened fire simultaneously along an 80-mile front. The barrage was so intense that soldiers 20 miles away felt the ground shake beneath their feet. Private First Class John McKinley of the 99th Infantry Division was eating breakfast when the shelling began. Years later, he would write in his memoir, "The world ended in fire and noise. Trees exploded into splinters above our heads. The earth opened up and swallowed men whole." We had been told the Germans were finished. In 30 seconds, we learned how terribly wrong we were. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine. Hitler's plan was audacious to the point of madness. German panzers would smash through the American lines, race to the Meuse River, and capture the vital port of Antwerp, 125 miles away. This would split the British and American armies, force a negotiated peace in the West, and allow Germany to turn all its resources against the advancing Soviet forces in the East. The plan had one critical requirement: speed. The German columns had to capture key road junctions before American reinforcements could arrive. And there was one town where 7 major highways converged. A small Belgian market town on a plateau in the Ardennes Highlands, a place most Americans had never heard of, a place that would become legendary, Bastogne. On December 17th, at Supreme Headquarters in Versailles, General Dwight Eisenhower grasped the situation with remarkable clarity. He had only 2 divisions in reserve, 2 units resting and refitting after brutal combat in Holland, the 82nd Airborne Division and the 101st Airborne Division. Neither was ready for combat. Eisenhower ordered them to Belgium immediately. The 82nd would block German advances in the north. The 101st would hold Bastogne. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. On the night of December 17th, the paratroopers of the 101st Airborne were loaded onto trucks in Montmelon-le-Grand, France. They had no winter clothing. Many had no helmets. Ammunition was scarce. They were given no time to prepare, no time to plan. Just an order. Get to Bastogne. Hold it. Don't let the Germans through. Private Donald Burgett of the 506th Parachute Infantry Regiment remembered the convoy ride through the freezing night. We passed American troops heading the other direction, retreating. Some had thrown away their weapons. Their eyes were hollow, terrified. They shouted at us through the darkness. "Turn back! There's too many of them. They'll kill you all." But we kept going. We were airborne. We didn't know how to turn back. The convoy stretched for miles. 380 trucks carrying 11,840 men of the 101st Airborne Division. They drove through snow and sleet on treacherous roads, racing against time, racing against an entire German army converging on the same objective. The lead elements of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment reached Bastogne just after midnight on December 19th. They had won the race, by 4 hours. Major General Maxwell Taylor, the division commander, was in Washington. Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe, the division artillery commander, took temporary command. McAuliffe was not a paratrooper by training. He was an artilleryman, methodical, calm, unflappable. In the coming days, these qualities would prove invaluable. His first order was simple: form a perimeter, 360 degrees. Because they were going to be surrounded, the 101st Airborne formed a defensive ring around Bastogne using every available unit. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment took positions on the northwestern shoulder to block the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. The 506th PIR deployed to defend the approach from Neuville in the north. The 501st PIR covered the eastern approaches. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment scattered from the village of Marvy in the southeast to Champs in the west, covering the southern perimeter. But a perimeter drawn on a map is just lines. Making it real required men in foxholes. Outposts pushed forward to provide early warning, roadblocks to channel German attacks. And this is where our 12 paratroopers enter the story. On the afternoon of December 19th, Staff Sergeant James Martin received his orders. Take 11 men. Move 3 miles southeast to the crossroads near Saint-Lez. Establish an observation post. Report enemy movement. Hold the position. Martin was 22 years old. He had jumped into Normandy on D-Day. He had fought through Holland during Operation Market Garden. He was a veteran by any measure. But as he looked at the terrain he was ordered to defend, he felt the weight of an impossible task. The crossroads was vital. If German forces broke through here, they could roll up the entire southern flank of the Bastogne perimeter. But his position was exposed. No natural cover, open fields on 3 sides. The nearest friendly units were half a mile away. The 12 men who marched out to that crossroads that afternoon represented the 101st Airborne Division in microcosm. Sergeant Thomas Riley from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, had been a high school football star. Corporal Michael Chen, a first-generation Chinese-American from San Francisco, spoke 3 languages. Private First Class Robert Johnson from rural Alabama had never been more than 50 miles from his home before the Army. Private Eugene Kowalski from Chicago worked in his father's butcher shop and dreamed of opening his own restaurant after the war. They dug their foxholes in the frozen earth. Each hole took hours to excavate. The ground was so hard that entrenching tools broke. They used rifle butts, helmets, bare hands bloodied by ice and rock. By nightfall on December 19th, they had created a defensive position that barely deserved the name. Shallow holes offering minimal protection. A single machine gun position with interlocking fields of fire. 2 bazooka teams positioned to cover the road. That first night was quiet. Too quiet. They could hear German vehicles moving in the darkness beyond the tree line. See the glow of fires from enemy encampments. Estimate unit strength by engine sounds. Martin reported everything to command. The response was always the same. Hold your position. Reinforcements are coming. But reinforcements never came. Because there were no reinforcements to send. December 20th dawned grey and bitterly cold. The temperature had dropped to 10 degrees Fahrenheit. Fog rolled across the fields, reducing visibility to less than 100 yards. Martin and his men heated ration tins over small fires that they knew gave away their positions but were necessary to prevent frostbite. They had been in position 24 hours. They had slept in shifts. 2 men awake at all times, watching, listening, waiting. At 07:30, the fog began to lift. And that's when they saw them, German infantry emerging from the tree line. Not a patrol, not a reconnaissance element, an assault force. Martin counted quickly. 200 men, maybe more. Behind them, tanks. He recognized the profiles. Panzer Mark IVs, at least 6 of them. Against 12 Americans in shallow foxholes with no anti-tank weapons heavier than bazookas, the Germans advanced with confidence. They had encountered scattered American resistance all along their route, small units that fired a few shots and withdrew. They expected the same here. A token defense, then a clear road to Bastogne. What they found instead was something they didn't expect. Americans who refused to move. Martin let them come. 400 yards, 300. The machine gunner's finger rested on the trigger, waiting for the signal. 200 yards. Martin could see individual faces now. Young men like his own. Scared. Cold. Following orders. At 150 yards, he raised his hand, then dropped it. The machine gun opened fire. The sound shattered the morning silence. German soldiers fell in the snow. Others dove for cover. The advance staggered, confused. But the Germans had overwhelming numbers. They returned fire with rifles, machine guns, mortars. Rounds cracked overhead, slammed into frozen earth, ricocheted off rocks. Private Johnson, firing his M1 Garand with methodical precision, shouted over the noise. "How many are there?" Riley, loading the machine gun, shouted back. "Too many. Way too many." But he also thought about the men behind them, the thousands of paratroopers defending Bastogne, the civilians sheltering in cellars, the entire perimeter that depended on positions like this, holding firm. The second German assault came with more coordination, infantry advancing under covering fire from tanks. The Panzer Mark IVs rumbled forward, their 75mm guns seeking targets. Corporal Chen, manning one of the bazooka teams, waited until a tank was less than 100 yards away. Fired. The rocket streaked across the frozen field and struck the tank's front glacis plate. The explosion was spectacular but ineffective. The armor was too thick. The tank kept coming. Chen reloaded frantically, fired again, this time aiming for the tank's tracks. The second rocket hit true. The tank slewed sideways, track destroyed, blocking the road behind it. The crew bailed out, running for cover. First kill. But 5 more tanks remained, and now the Germans knew the Americans had anti-tank weapons. The battle raged for 3 hours. The Germans would mass for an assault. The Americans would break it up with concentrated fire. Then the Germans would regroup and try again. Martin's radio operator maintained constant contact with command. Each transmission was the same. "We're holding. Request artillery support." The response never varied. "Artillery is prioritized for the main perimeter. You must hold with what you have." What they had was running low. Ammunition, food, hope. By midday on December 20th, Riley's machine gun had less than 100 rounds remaining. The bazooka teams were down to their last 2 rockets. Private Kowalski had taken shrapnel to his shoulder but refused evacuation. "Where would I go?" he asked, wrapping the wound with strips torn from his undershirt. "We're all staying together." And that, perhaps, was the secret of their defense. They were not 12 individuals. They were a unit. They had trained together, jumped together, fought together. They trusted each other with their lives because they had proven that trust in Normandy, in Holland, and now here in frozen Belgium. When one man's ammunition ran low, another shared his supply. When someone was wounded, the medic moved through fire to reach him. When morale wavered, someone told a joke, recalled a memory of home, reminded them why they were here. The German commander facing them was Major Hans Kruger of the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. He had expected to brush aside token resistance and advance on Bastogne. Instead, he had been stopped for hours by what appeared to be a well-fortified position with heavy weapons. He had no way of knowing it was 12 men in shallow foxholes with dwindling ammunition. Military intelligence suggested that American forces at Bastogne numbered in the thousands with substantial artillery support. The fierce resistance at this crossroads seemed to confirm that assessment. What Kruger didn't understand was the psychology of the American paratrooper. These men had volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the army. They had endured brutal training designed to eliminate the weak. They had jumped from aircraft into enemy fire because they believed they were elite, superior, capable of the impossible. And when faced with impossible odds, they didn't calculate probabilities. They simply fought. As darkness fell on December 20th, the German attacks paused. Martin's men used the respite to redistribute ammunition, treat wounds, and eat cold rations. They had been in continuous combat for more than 12 hours. 2 men were seriously wounded. Everyone else bore minor injuries, cuts, bruises, shrapnel fragments, the kind of wounds you ignore in combat and pay for later. Riley crawled to Martin's foxhole. "Sarge, we can't hold another day like today. We're almost out of everything." Martin nodded. He knew the mathematics. They had maybe 200 rifle rounds remaining, less than 50 machine gun rounds, 1 bazooka rocket, no grenades, no mortar ammunition, against an enemy force that could call up reinforcements at will. But Martin also knew something else. They had held for 24 hours. Every hour they held was an hour the Germans weren't advancing on Bastogne. Every German soldier tied down here was one less attacking the main perimeter. Their mission wasn't to win, it was to delay, to disrupt, to make the Germans pay for every yard, and by that measure they were succeeding beyond all reasonable expectations. The radio crackled. Command wanted a status report. Martin gave it honestly. "We're low on everything. 2 wounded. But we're still here. Still holding." There was a pause. Then, "Martin, you and your men are buying time for the entire division. General McAuliffe knows what you're doing out there. Hold 1 more day. Just 1 more day. Can you do that?" Martin looked at his men, exhausted, freezing, running on determination and not much else. He thought about the odds, about the Germans regrouping in the darkness, about the attacks that would come at dawn. Then he pressed the transmit button. "Roger. We'll hold." What Martin and his men didn't know was that their small action was being replicated across the entire Bastogne perimeter. Dozens of outposts, hundreds of small groups, each holding fragments of the line, each convinced they were alone, each determined not to let down the men beside them. This was the true genius of the 101st Airborne's defense. Not grand strategy, not superior firepower, but thousands of individual acts of courage by men who refused to quit. The night of December 20th was the coldest yet. The temperature dropped to near zero. Men huddled in foxholes, sharing body heat, trying to stay alert despite exhaustion that made eyelids feel like lead. Private Johnson stood watch, stamping his feet to maintain circulation. His feet had lost feeling hours ago. He knew that meant frostbite. He also knew there was nothing he could do about it. The mission came first, always. As midnight approached, strange sounds carried across the frozen fields, German voices singing, Christmas carols, Still Nacht, Silent Night. For a moment, the war paused. Men on both sides remembered it was December, that Christmas was coming, that they were all far from home, cold and scared and wishing they were anywhere else. Then the singing stopped, and both sides returned to the business of trying to kill each other. December 21st dawned with the same grey fog, the same bitter cold, the same sense of impending violence. Martin's men prepared for another day of combat with methodical efficiency born of desperation. They cleaned weapons with numb fingers, arranged remaining ammunition for maximum efficiency, made peace with the possibility that this might be their last day. At 0800, the German attack resumed. But this time it was different. More coordinated, more aggressive. Kruger had been reinforced overnight. His 200 men had grown to 500. His 6 tanks had been replaced by 8, including 2 heavier Panther, tanks with even thicker armour. He had been ordered to clear this roadblock, today, by any means necessary. The assault began with artillery. German mortars walking fire across the American position, explosions that made the earth heave and buck, shrapnel that screamed through the air seeking flesh. Chen's foxhole took a direct hit. When the smoke cleared, he was unconscious, bleeding from his ears. The medic, Corporal David Sanders, crawled through the barrage to reach him, started treatment even as rounds impacted around them. Then came the tanks. 8 armoured monsters advancing in a line, infantry following in their wake. The Americans had 1 bazooka rocket remaining. Martin made the hardest decision of his life. He gave the rocket to Private Eddie Martinez, the best shot in the squad. "Make it count," he said. "Everything depends on this." Martinez positioned himself in a foxhole with a clear view of the road, waited as the lead Panther approached. 75 yards, 50. At 40 yards, close enough to see the commander in the open hatch, he fired. The rocket struck the tank's side armour at the perfect angle. Penetrated. The tank exploded from within. Ammunition cooking off in a secondary explosion that sent flames 200 feet into the air. The tank behind it swerved, crashed into a ditch, became stuck. But 6 tanks remained, and now the Americans had no anti-tank weapons at all. Riley fired the last machine gun rounds in controlled bursts, making each bullet count. When the gun clicked empty, he threw it aside, grabbed his rifle, kept firing. Johnson, Kowalski, every man on the line shooting until barrels grew hot enough to burn hands. The Germans reached the foxholes. Combat became intimate, brutal, terrifying. Hand-to-hand fighting in frozen holes, rifle butts used as clubs, trenching tools as weapons, men grappling in the snow, fighting for their lives with whatever they could grab. Martin found himself face-to-face with a German soldier barely, older than 18. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, recognition of shared humanity. Then training and survival instinct took over. When it was over, when the Germans finally pulled back, 6 of Martin's 12 men were still standing. The others were wounded or dead. The position was littered with empty brass casings, spent rocket tubes, abandoned equipment. But they had held, against impossible odds, against an enemy force that should have overrun them 10 times over. They had held. Martin's hands shook as he reached for the radio. "We need—" The radio operator interrupted. "Martin, relief is coming. A patrol from the main perimeter. You did it. You held long enough. Get your men out of there. You've earned it." As the relief patrol approached, Martin looked at what remained of his squad. Young men aged years in 3 days, warriors forged in frozen hell, survivors of a battle they never should have won. Riley, his hands wrapped in bloodied bandages, grinned weakly. Sarge, did we actually stop them? Martin nodded. We stopped them, or at least slowed them down enough. That's all they asked us to do. But the larger question remained unanswered. Had their sacrifice mattered? Had 3 days of desperate fighting by 12 men really made a difference? To answer that, we must pull back and see the larger picture. What was happening across the entire Bastogne perimeter, and why actions like Martin's small stand were pieces of a much larger story. By December 21st, 1944, the situation inside Bastogne had deteriorated from difficult to desperate. 18,000 American troops were completely surrounded by approximately 55,000 Germans. 7 highways leading into the town had been cut. No supplies could reach them by road. The weather had grounded all Allied aircraft for 6 consecutive days. Food was running low. Ammunition was rationed. Medical supplies were nearly exhausted after most of the division's medical company was captured on the first night. The defenders were outnumbered approximately 5 to 1. They lacked winter clothing in temperatures that dropped below 10 degrees Fahrenheit every night. Many soldiers had no helmets. Some had no weapons beyond what they'd grabbed during the hasty deployment from France. By every military calculation, by every tactical assessment, Bastogne should have fallen. The Germans certainly believed it would. General Heinrich Freiherr von Luttwitz commanded the 47th Panzer Corps surrounding Bastogne. He had at his disposal the elite 2nd Panzer Division, the veteran Panzer Lehr Division, and the 26th Volksgrenadier Division. Combined, these units fielded over 100 tanks and assault guns, hundreds of artillery pieces, and tens of thousands of infantry. Von Luttwitz had fought on the Eastern Front. He had seen Soviet resistance collapse under similar circumstances. He expected the Americans to break, to run, or to surrender. What von Luttwitz failed to understand was the nature of the American paratrooper. These men had volunteered for airborne duty, knowing it offered the highest casualty rates in the army. They had endured training specifically designed to weed out anyone who might quit under pressure. They had jumped into Normandy on D-Day, dropped into Holland during Market Garden. They had proven themselves in combat against the best the Wehrmacht could field, and they had developed an almost arrogant belief in their own superiority. This psychological factor, more than any tactical consideration, explains what happened at Bastogne. When faced with impossible odds, ordinary soldiers might calculate the probability of survival and decide surrender makes sense. Paratroopers didn't think that way. They believed they were elite, superior, capable of achieving what others considered impossible. This wasn't bravado, it was identity. Being a paratrooper wasn't just what they did. It was who they were. Across the Bastogne perimeter, in dozens of positions like Staff Sergeant Martin's outpost, small groups of paratroopers held fragments of the defensive line. At the village of Marvy in the southeast, a platoon of the 327th Glider Infantry Regiment faced repeated assaults by the entire 5th Parachute Division. At Chumps in the west, men of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment dug into frozen earth and refused to yield a single yard. At Neuville in the north, Team de Sobry of the 10th Armoured Division fought a delaying action that cost them dearly but bought precious time. Each position operated in relative isolation. Radio communication was sporadic. Visual contact with neighbouring units was often impossible in the fog and snow, yet each position held because the men in those foxholes understood something fundamental. If they broke, the entire perimeter might collapse. The soldier next to them was depending on them. The division was depending on them. America was depending on them, and they would rather die than let anyone down. On the morning of December 22nd, German frustration reached its peak. Von Luttwitz had expected to capture Bastogne by December 18th. Now, 4 days behind schedule, with his offensive losing momentum across the entire Ardennes front, he made a decision born of desperation, masked as magnanimity. He would offer the Americans a chance to surrender. At 11:30 a.m., 4 German officers approached American lines under a white flag of truce. They carried a typewritten ultimatum addressed to the U.S.A., commander of the encircled town of Bastogne. The message was clear and ominous. The fortune of war is changing. This time the U.S.A. forces in and near Bastogne have been encircled by strong German armoured units. There is only one possibility to save the encircled U.S.A. troops from total annihilation. That is, the honourable surrender of the 12 encircled town. The ultimatum gave the Americans 2 hours to respond. If they refused, Bastogne would be subjected to annihilation. Every soldier, every civilian, total destruction. The German officers waited with supreme confidence. They had every reason to be confident. The Americans were surrounded, outnumbered, running low on everything. Surely they would see reason. Surely they would accept the honourable way out. The surrender demand reached Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe at his command post in the Belgian Army barracks in central Bastogne. McAuliffe was conferring with his staff about artillery ammunition rationing when Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard brought him the message. McAuliffe read it, looked up at Kinnard, and said simply, "Oh, nuts." Then he went back to discussing artillery allocations. Kinnard had to remind him that the Germans required a formal response. McAuliffe asked his staff what he should say. Someone suggested his first reaction was perfect. "What did you say?" McAuliffe asked. "You said nuts," Kinnard replied. McAuliffe grinned. "That's it." The formal reply, delivered to the German officers at 1:50 p.m., was typed on a single sheet of paper. To the German commander. Nuts. The American commander. The German officers were confused. They didn't understand the American slang. When Colonel Joseph Harper, who delivered the reply, saw their confusion, he explained in simple terms, "It means go to hell." Then he added, "If you continue to attack, we will kill every German that tries to break into this city." The German officers departed in stunned silence. They had offered an honourable surrender. The Americans had responded with defiance bordering on mockery. What the Germans didn't know was how desperate the situation inside Bastogne truly was. McAuliffe's confident rejection masked a reality that grew more dire by the hour. Artillery units were rationed to 10 rounds per gun per day. Some infantry companies were down to a single day's ammunition. The wounded filled every available building, with doctors performing surgery by candlelight when generators failed. Frostbite cases multiplied daily as men stood watch in inadequate clothing. Food was scarce enough that soldiers joked about their luxury diet. 1 can of processed meat shared among 3 men, hardtack biscuits so old they cracked teeth, snow melted for drinking water. Private Vincent Speranza of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment would later recall stealing flour from a Belgian bakery to make pancakes for his entire platoon. "We were so hungry. We ate them raw," he remembered. "Flour and water mixed together and frozen. We thought it was delicious." But on December 23rd, everything changed. That morning, soldiers woke to see something they hadn't seen in a week. Blue sky. The weather had cleared. By 0900 hours, the distant drone of aircraft engines brought men scrambling from their positions. They looked up to see C-47 transport planes, dozens of them, flying in perfect formation. The airdrop had begun. The first parachutes blossomed over Bastogne at 9:40 a.m. Red, yellow, blue, and white canopies drifting down carrying ammunition, medical supplies, food, and gasoline. Men cheered, laughed. Some cried openly as they raced across snow-covered fields to retrieve the containers. Fighter aircraft circled overhead, P-47 Thunderbolts providing cover and looking for targets. The siege was not broken, but the noose had loosened. Over the next 3 days, 241 C-47 sorties delivered more than 1,200 tons of supplies. The 9th Air Force flew 961 missions total. The recovery rate for airdropped supplies reached an astonishing 95%. Crews worked frantically, sometimes under German artillery fire, to retrieve every container, every package, every precious round of ammunition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The clear weather brought another advantage: close air support. P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings prowled the sky, hunting German armor. The German tanks and vehicles, painted in summer camouflage of green and brown, stood out starkly against the white snow. Pilots reported what they called a target-rich environment. One pilot described it as shooting fish in a barrel, except the fish were shooting back with 88mm guns. Technical Sergeant Francis Sampson, Catholic chaplain of the 501st Parachute Infantry Regiment, moved through the perimeter, providing spiritual comfort to men facing death daily. He would later describe December 23rd as a turning point, not just tactically, but psychologically. When the planes came, when the supplies fell from heaven, the men's spirits lifted visibly. They went from simply surviving to believing they could win. That shift in mindset was more valuable than all the ammunition we received. But supplies alone didn't break the siege. The German attacks continued with renewed fury. On Christmas Eve, the Luftwaffe launched a 4-night bombing campaign against Bastogne. Junkers Ju-88 bombers struck military and civilian targets. The town that had already suffered from artillery bombardment now endured aerial assault. Buildings collapsed, fires raged, civilian casualties mounted, yet the defense held. Private First Class James Hendricks of the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was on perimeter watch when the bombers came on Christmas Eve. We could see them in the moonlight, black shapes against the stars. The bombs fell with this whistling sound that made your stomach drop, then the explosions, the ground shaking, buildings collapsing, and we just sat in our foxholes, unable to do anything but wait and hope the next bomb didn't have our name on it. Christmas Day, 1944, found the defenders of Bastogne in a strange liminal space between hope and despair. The supply situation had improved, but they were still surrounded. The weather allowed air support, but German pressure remained relentless. Men tried to maintain morale with small gestures. Someone found a Christmas tree and set it up in a command post. Chaplains held services in frozen foxholes. Soldiers shared the last of their cigarettes and told stories of Christmases past. That morning, Lieutenant Colonel Harry Kinnard drafted a Christmas message from General McAuliffe to the troops. "What's merry about all this?" you ask. "We're fighting. It's cold. We aren't home." All true. But what has the proud Eagle Division accomplished with its worthy comrades of the 10th Armored Division, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, and all the rest? Just this. We have stopped cold everything that has been thrown at us, from the north, east, south, and west. The message continued with words that captured the spirit of the defense. We have identifications from 4 German panzer divisions, 2 German infantry divisions, and 1 German parachute division. These units, spearheading the last desperate German lunge, were headed straight west for key ports when the Eagle Division was hurriedly ordered to stem the advance. How effectively this was done will be written in history, not alone in our division's glorious history, but in world history. But the most crucial development of Christmas Day was happening 100 miles to the south. General George S. Patton's Third Army was executing what would become known as one of the most remarkable military movements in history. On December 19th, at a conference in Verdun, Eisenhower had asked Patton how soon he could disengage from his current operations, pivot 90 degrees north, and attack the southern flank of the German penetration. Patton answered immediately. On December 22nd, with 3 divisions. The other generals in the room thought he was joking. Such a maneuver required moving 250,000 men, 133,000 vehicles, across icy roads, through difficult terrain, in brutal winter weather. Military planning doctrine suggested such a movement required at least a week of preparation. Patton promised to do it in 3 days, and he did. The secret was advance planning. While other Allied commanders dismissed the possibility of a German offensive through the Ardennes, Patton's staff had war-gamed exactly such a scenario. When it happened, they already had detailed plans prepared, routes mapped, traffic control points identified, supply dumps positioned. All they needed was the order to execute. On December 22nd, as promised, Patton's Third Army attacked northward toward Bastogne. The spearhead was the 4th Armored Division, commanded by Major General Hugh Gaffey. Leading the 4th Armoured's charge was Combat Command R, an armoured task force built around the 37th Tank Battalion, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Creighton Abrams. Abrams was aggressive, brilliant, and utterly fearless. His tanks would become the tip of the spear driving toward Bastogne. But the German defences were formidable. Every village had been fortified, every road mined, every bridge prepared for demolition. The 4th Armoured fought through one strong point after another. Small towns became battlefields. Chaumont, Bigonville, Assenois, each required combined arms assault. Tanks, infantry, artillery, air support, each cost time and blood. The race to reach Bastogne before it fell became a test of speed versus attrition. Inside Bastogne, the defenders knew relief was coming, but didn't know when it would arrive. German pressure intensified as von Lüttwitz threw everything at the perimeter in desperate attempts to break through before Patton's army arrived. The battle became a macabre race. Could the Germans crush the defence before relief arrived? Could the Americans hold long enough to be rescued? Staff Sergeant Martin and the survivors of his small unit had been rotated back to defensive positions closer to Bastogne after their 3-day stand at the crossroads. Of his original 12 men, 6 had been evacuated with serious wounds. The remaining 6, including Martin, Riley, Johnson, and Kowalski, were reassigned to a position on the southern perimeter, exactly where Patton's relief column would attempt to break through. On the afternoon of December 26th, Martin's men heard something that made their hearts race. The distant rumble of tank engines, American engines, the distinctive sound of Sherman tanks. Then, over the ridge south of their position, they saw it, the White Star, the unmistakable marking of U.S. armor. Lieutenant Colonel Abrams's lead tank, a Sherman named Cobra King, commanded by Lieutenant Charles Boggess, crashed through German lines and made contact with American forces in Bastogne at 4:45 p.m. Men emerged from foxholes, shouting, cheering, embracing each other. Some laughed. Some cried. Many did both. They had held for 7 days. 7 days of continuous combat against overwhelming odds. 7 days of cold, hunger, fear, and doubt. And they had not broken. The relief had arrived. The siege, while not completely lifted, had been breached. Private Johnson, his feet black with frostbite, tears streaming down his face, turned to Martin. "Sarge, did we really do it? Did we actually hold Bastogne?" Martin looked at the young soldier, then at the battered men around him, then at the approaching American tanks. "We did more than hold it," he said quietly. "We proved something, to the Germans, to ourselves, to the world. But the battle was far from over. The corridor Patton punched through was narrow, barely wide enough for single-file traffic. German forces continued attacking, trying to cut the supply line. The 101st Airborne remained in combat, now pushing outward to expand the corridor and clear German forces from the surrounding area. Villages that had been abandoned during the initial encirclement now had to be retaken. Noville, Foy, Rachamps, each required bitter fighting in brutal conditions. The cost had been tremendous. From December 19th to January 6th, the 101st Airborne Division suffered 482 killed in action, 2,449 wounded, and 527 missing or captured. Combat Command B of the 10th Armoured Division lost approximately 500 men. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, which had provided critical anti-tank support, suffered heavy casualties. Civilian losses in Bastogne and surrounding villages numbered in the hundreds. German casualties around Bastogne were even higher, approximately 15,000 killed, wounded, or missing. Over 100 tanks and assault guns destroyed. Entire battalions rendered combat ineffective. But more importantly, the defence of Bastogne had broken the timetable of Hitler's offensive. The German spearheads had been stopped short of the Meuse River. The offensive that was supposed to reach Antwerp in a week had stalled completely. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, overall German commander in the West, would admit in post-war interrogation that Bastogne was the critical failure point of the entire offensive. "We needed that road junction by December 18th, he stated. When the Americans held for a week, then were reinforced, we knew the offensive had failed. Everything after that was simply delaying the inevitable. The strategic implications were profound. The Battle of the Bulge consumed Germany's last strategic reserves. 25 divisions, the cream of what remained of the Wehrmacht, had been committed to the offensive. In 6 weeks of fighting, they suffered between 81,000 and 98,000 casualties. They lost over 600 tanks, more than 1,000 aircraft, and critical supplies of fuel and ammunition. These were losses Germany could never replace. American casualties were also severe, approximately 81,000, including 19,000 killed. But America could replace these losses. Fresh divisions were arriving from the United States at the rate of 1 per week. Industrial production provided endless streams of equipment. The balance of power, which had briefly seemed uncertain, now tilted decisively toward the Allies. More importantly, the offensive had cost Germany its ability to defend against the Soviet winter offensive, launched on January 12, 1945. With all strategic reserves committed and destroyed in the Ardennes, Germany had nothing to stop the Red Army's advance toward Berlin. The path to ending the war in Europe was now clear. For the men who defended Bastogne, the recognition came slowly but meaningfully. The 101st Airborne Division headquarters was awarded the Presidential Unit Citation with a streamer-embroidered Bastogne for the division's colours. The division also received the Belgian Croix de Guerre 1940 with palm and was cited in the Order of the Day of the Belgian Army. Individual decorations included Medal of Honor awards, Distinguished Service Crosses, Silver Stars, and Bronze Stars by the hundreds. But perhaps more meaningful than medals was the nickname that emerged from the battle. The regiments of the 101st became known as the Battered Bastards of Bastogne. The men wore the name with fierce pride. They had been battered, beaten, pushed to the absolute limit of human endurance. And they had not broken. That identity, forged in frozen foxholes around a small Belgian town, would define the division forever. Staff Sergeant James Martin received the Silver Star for his leadership of the Crossroads defence. The citation recognised his gallantry in action and inspiring leadership under fire. But Martin would later say that the real heroes were the men who didn't come back. The soldiers who died holding positions that military doctrine said couldn't be held. The wounded who refused evacuation because they didn't want to abandon their friends. The medics who crawled through fire to reach casualties. The ordinary men who did extraordinary things simply because the situation demanded it. In the years after the war, veterans of Bastogne gathered regularly. They came from farms and factories, offices and shops. They brought their families, introduced their children, told and retold the stories of that frozen December. The bond they shared transcended the normal friendships of peacetime. They had seen each other at the absolute worst and best moments of human experience. They had shared fear, cold, hunger, and the constant proximity of death. And they had discovered something profound about themselves and each other. Sergeant Thomas Riley, who returned to Iowa and resumed his life as a teacher and coach, would speak at high school assemblies about his experiences. He always emphasized the same themes. We weren't heroes in the way movies show heroes. We were scared kids doing a job that needed doing. We held not because we were fearless, but because we feared letting each other down more than we feared death. That's what courage really is. Not absence of fear, but refusing to let fear dictate your actions. Corporal Michael Chen returned to San Francisco and used the GI Bill to attend law school. He became a prominent attorney and civil rights advocate. He credited his Bastogne experience with teaching him that ordinary people, when pushed to their limits, are capable of extraordinary things. We were 12 men against hundreds, he would tell his children. By every logical measure, we should have been overrun in hours, but we held for 3 days. Why? Because we believed we could, because we refused to accept defeat. That lesson applies to every challenge in life. Private First Class Robert Johnson's feet, never, fully recovered from the frostbite. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life, but he never complained. I got to walk home, he would say. A lot of men didn't. I consider myself lucky. He returned to Alabama, married his high school sweetheart, raised 6 children, and lived to see his grandchildren graduate college. At his funeral in 2003, his granddaughter read from a letter he had written but never sent during the siege. "If I don't make it home, tell Mama I was brave, tell her I did my duty, tell her I died among friends." Private Eugene Kowalski did open that restaurant he dreamed of. Kowalski's Steakhouse in Chicago became a gathering place for veterans. The walls were covered with photographs from the war. A corner table was permanently reserved for the Bastogne Boys, as the regular group of veterans called themselves. Every December, they gathered to remember, to toast fallen friends, to remind each other that they had been part of something larger than themselves. The legacy of Bastogne extends beyond the men who fought there. The battle became a symbol in American military culture, a shorthand for determination against impossible odds. When soldiers face difficult situations, someone invariably references Bastogne. The stand became a case study at military academies worldwide. How do you hold when holding seems impossible? How do you maintain morale when logic says you're beaten? How do you inspire ordinary men to achieve extraordinary things? The answer, as demonstrated at Bastogne, lies not in tactics or technology, but in leadership, training, and unit cohesion. The paratroopers held because they were well trained, because their leaders led from the front, because they trusted each other completely, because their identity as elite soldiers wouldn't allow them to quit. These intangible factors proved more valuable than all the tanks and artillery in the Wehrmacht's arsenal. Winston Churchill, addressing Parliament in January 1945, declared, "This is undoubtedly the greatest American battle of the war, and will, I believe, be regarded as an ever-famous American victory." Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, never quick to praise American forces, admitted, "The Americans at Bastogne wrote one of the finest chapters in military history. Their stand will be remembered as long as men honor courage." But perhaps the most fitting tribute came from former Wehrmacht General Heinrich von Luttwitz, whose 47th Panzer Corps had surrounded Bastogne. In 1954, visiting the memorial, he saluted and said, "They were magnificent enemies who became better friends. They fought not for conquest but for principle. That is why they deserved to win." Today, the Madison Memorial stands on a hill overlooking Bastogne, a star-shaped monument honoring the 76,890 American soldiers killed in the Battle of the Bulge. Every December 16th at 5:30 a.m., the exact moment the German offensive began, bells ring throughout Bastogne. In the town square stands a Sherman tank, Barracuda, from the 11th Armored Division. Children play on it, climbing over the same armor that helped liberate their grandparents. The story of the 12 paratroopers who held the crossroads southeast of Bastogne for 72 hours is not unique. Similar stories unfolded across the entire perimeter, small groups holding impossible positions, performing acts of courage that went unrecorded, dying in forgotten foxholes. But collectively, these small stands created the larger legend. Bastogne held not because of grand strategy, but because thousands of individual soldiers decided they would rather die than retreat. Staff Sergeant Martin lived to be 92 years old. He rarely talked about the war. When pressed by grandchildren, he would say simply, "We did what needed doing. Nothing more, nothing less." But in his final days, suffering from pneumonia in a hospital bed, he became delirious and spoke to people long dead. He called out names: Riley, Chen, Johnson, Kowalski. Men he had led into battle 70 years earlier, men he had watched bleed and die, men he had never forgotten. His daughter, sitting beside his bed, heard him whisper, "We held. Tell them we held." She held his hand and whispered back, "They know, Dad. Everyone knows. You held." He smiled then and passed peacefully. The broader lesson of Bastogne transcends military history. It speaks to something fundamental about human nature when confronted with existential crisis. When retreat is impossible and surrender unthinkable, ordinary people discover reserves of strength they didn't know they possessed. Not because they're superhuman, but because circumstances demand it and they refuse to fail the people beside them. The 12 paratroopers who faced hundreds of German soldiers at a frozen crossroads believed they were alone, fighting their own small battle, doing their duty in obscurity. They didn't know their stand was being replicated around the entire perimeter, didn't know they were part of something legendary. They just knew they had been given a position to hold and a responsibility to the men beside them. So they held. For 3 days. Against impossible odds. Because that's what paratroopers do. When German forces mocked the Americans trapped at Bastogne, when they promised annihilation, when they offered honorable surrender, they fundamentally misunderstood what they were facing. These weren't conscripts fighting for conquest. These were volunteers fighting for each other. For principle. For the belief that free men defending freedom are stronger than any army fighting for tyranny. The relief of Bastogne didn't end the Battle of the Bulge. Fighting continued for another month, but it broke the back of Hitler's offensive. The German dream of splitting the Allied armies died in the snow around a small Belgian town, killed by paratroopers in frozen foxholes, by artillery crews firing until barrels glowed, by medics treating wounded under fire, by ordinary Americans who simply refused to quit. 80 years later, the story still resonates, because it's not really about tactics or strategy, it's about human spirit, about what people can achieve when they believe in something larger than themselves, about courage not as absence of fear but as refusal to let fear win, about ordinary men who, for a few terrible days in December 1944, did something extraordinary. The German mockery died in the snow around Bastogne, buried beneath the thunder of Patton's advancing tanks and the unconquerable spirit of surrounded paratroopers who simply refused to quit. In its place grew respect, then admiration, and finally, friendship. The fortress of democracy had held, the arsenal of freedom had triumphed, and in that triumph, the future of the free world was secured. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.